Hi everyone, welcome to an online lesson on comparison. So what we'll do today is that we'll go about answering compare and contrast questions, and then we'll cover types of compare and contrast questions. Now let's start off by talking about the types of SBQ comparison questions. You realize there are around 8 kinds of comparison questions. Now it's very important that you familiarize yourself with different kinds of comparison question because it affects how you answer. Now, for example, if the question is asking like how similar or how different, to what extent are the sources similar, to what extent are the sources different, then you know because there's a word how or to what extent, there's an element of evaluation there. Then for comparison of content, you need to talk about both similarity and difference. Now, if the question is asking in what ways are the sources similar or in what ways are the sources different, the phrasing in what ways is like almost asking you to list, then you just talk about one similarity of content, similarity of tone or purpose, or difference in content and difference in tone or purpose. So it's really one side all the way. Now, let's take a quiz on whether or not you are familiar with what is required for each question requirements. So, for example, how different are sources A and B versus in what ways are sources A and B different? How do we go about answering? How different in terms of the instruction words is basically asking you to what extent. That's the degree of difference. So this is where you take a look at both similarities and differences between the given sources. For question B, they're asking you for in what ways. So this is where we are only taking a look at differences from the start all the way to the end. So difference in content, difference in tone, difference in purpose. Okay, let's practice again. If the question is asking to what extent is source C similar to source D versus in what ways are sources A and B similar? To what extent, this is where you give your assessment on how far the sources are the same. So one similarity, one difference. But if the question is asking in what ways are the sources similar, you name all the ways that the sources are the same. Okay, so what or how do we compare? In social studies, we take a look at these 5 aspects: source type, provenance, content, tone, or purpose. Now, it feels like it's quite a lot, right? So these are the acronyms to help you remember. You can think of students, please concentrate to pass, or sweetie pie, cup of tea, please, whatever that works for you. Okay, so realize source type and provenance. These are very basics form of comparison. This is what I would call low level comparison. Now for low level comparison, just do one. If you want to compare source type, just talk about source type. If you want to compare provenance, just compare provenance. You don't have to do both, just do one. I always ask students to just try to do low level comparison because this is a form of a safety net for you before you move on to do higher level comparisons like content, tone, and purpose. Okay, so how to make comparisons? When you're making comparisons, obviously you're referring to two sources, right? This is where you need to look for basis of comparisons or common criteria. So what is common criteria? Common criteria is like the main idea or the base point or like the main topic that the two sources have in common. You need to have common criteria because it helps to scope your comparison answer so that your answer is clearer. I know exactly what you're trying to compare, because if not, your answer will be very messy. You will not get the appropriate level of marks. Okay, so this one you try on your own. Between Ali and Wilson, what is similar? How would you word the common criteria? So let's use source A and source B fruits as an example. Then the question is, how similar are the two sources? Before we go straight to comparing the sources, let's remind ourselves, if the question is asking how similar are the two sources, how, how do we go about comparing? Now, we take a look at source A and source B. They're both round in shape. So the similarity here, then I would say the common criteria is shape. Both are fruits. The common criteria is the type. Source A, apple red. Source B, orange is orange. So they are different, right? So this is comparison in terms of color. Source A, apple has a smooth surface. Source B, orange has a rough surface. They are different in terms of texture. So now that we've identified how the sources are similar or different, let's think about wording them out in a proper paragraph. So, how similar are two sources? Let's recap how do we go about answering. In terms of comparison of content, I will need one similarity and one difference. So if I want to write out in terms in like a proper sentence, I would say both sources are similar because they are fruits. Source A is an apple, source B is a shape. Is an orange. Another similarity is shape, both are round. You realize that even while pointing out similarities, I still talk about how they are similar. However, both sources are different in texture. Source A, the apple is smooth, source B is rough. Difference of color, if apple is orange, orange is orange. You realize even in identifying the differences, I talk about how exactly are they different. So just like how you are doing this with fruits, you need to make sure that you apply the same concept when you're comparing access sources. Okay, let's try again. Remind ourselves when we are comparing, we need common criteria before we elaborate on the answer. How exactly are the sources similar? Back up with evidence from the sources. So essentially, when you make a claim, make sure that you support your claim with justification from the sources. Use connective words to show similarity or difference. Words like also, like however. I will show you some sample of connective words. So now let's practice on access sources. We have source A. Please pause the video if you need more time to read. Source A. Now I will show you source B. Similarly, please pause the video if you need more time to read source B. Okay, because we are comparing sources A and B, I will show you side by side. The question that we are looking at here is how similar are both sources? Okay, so let's repeat again. If the question is asking how similar are both sources, then at content level, you need to take a look at both similarities and differences. After that, then we move on to highest level of tone or purpose where we look at similarity or difference depending on what we can see. So let's try. These are the three things that you should be writing for your comparison answer. Let's start off with low level comparison, our safety net, where you are taking a look at source type or provenance. If you cannot remember what is a provenance, provenance is essentially like the caption or the source, which I have arrowed out here. So all the details next to the word sources, source A, word source B, the details there, that is the provenance. So if I want to write out my low level comparison, then I will say both sources are similar in topic, both are about ERP, or both sources are different in provenance. Source A is taken from LTA website, source B is a comment from a member of the public. You realize that I am just writing one because it's just a safety net, no need to worry too much about it. Once I have secured my safety net, I am moving on to content. So realize I have highlighted some key ideas that seem similar. So make sure when you're doing comparison, your sources shouldn't be clean. It should be full of annotations. We should highlight in different color. One color for similarity, one color for differences. What I find to be helpful for students is if you write down the main ideas that each sources are talking about at the side. So summarize in one sentence what source is talking about. Essentially, source is talking about how there is a change in ERP rates. If I want to summarize what source B is talking about in one sentence, I will say that, I'm also talking about there's a change in ERP rates, there's an increase in ERP rates. So now I want to write it out in a paragraph, right? So both sources are similar as it talks about how there is a change in ERP rates. That is my common criteria. After that, I quote evidence from source A. Then I explain what source A is talking about to show how it supports the common criteria. Also, that is my connecting words. Then I will quote evidence from source B. Then I'll explain source B. So essentially, if let's say I were to cut out this paragraph and read it in isolation, it must flow. I must see how exactly are the sources similar. So this is where you need to make sure that there is a direct overlap between your evidences and your explanation clearly shows how the sources are talking about the same idea. So this is my similarity paragraph. Content paragraph number two, both sources are different as it talk about common criteria. But for the purpose of today's lesson, I will just show you similarity paragraph. But remember, for different same concept, common criteria, evidences from both sources, and then in your explanation, make sure that you show and you talk about how exactly are the sources different. Okay, so now I settle source start reading. I settle my low level comparison. I talk about content. Now remember, minimally I expect everyone to be able to settle part one, number one and number two, because this is something that we have been doing in lower sec history already. So it's not a brand new skill for you. Now let's move on to tone or purpose, where it's this one is something that is new for you to do for comparison. Okay, so what is tone? Tone is talking about emotions, feelings, and attitudes or author behind the source. This is something that we are used to doing in everyday life. When we read our friends' texts, when we see what someone is uploading online on social media, we know whether the person is happy or angry or emoing. Why? Because at, by now, we should be quite used to sensing tones based on what we see and what we read. So this should be something that you are familiar with. So this is a concept we do in a skill that we do in everyday life. Just transfer it over to social studies. Consider, do the sources sound the same? Are they neutral or biased towards the issues raised? Mm, what are the feelings of the speakers or writers about the feelings of the speakers or writers about the issue? So I always suggest to students, instead of wasting time trying to find vocabulary like appropriate words for tone, come to class or come to the exam hall with a word bank or words for tone. Of course, there are different kinds of words that can explain tone. It's not just limited to whatever that I'm showing now, but just make sure that you have a word bank for tone that you can just easily extract out any words that you need if you are trying to compare tone here. Okay, what if I want to compare purpose? Because sometimes not all sources will have a tone, or sometimes you can identify a tone in one source but not another source. Then how? Then we compare purpose. Every source will always have a purpose. So ask yourself, the source giver will have so many things to do in a day. Why is the source giver taking some time to produce this source? What is the motive or intention? So consider, why is he saying this? Why the sources say what they say? Are there any intentions? Look at the provenance. Who is talking? Identify the identity of the source giver. Does it tell us anything about the motives of the speakers or writers? So essentially, when you're comparing purpose, in a way or another, you are doing your inference of purpose for both sources, but you're just comparing to see whether or not the sources have similar inference of purpose or different. So based on this example here, I will say both sources are different in tone. Source A is very matter of fact, they're just telling you there's more gantries now, so this will affect the price rates because they're just source A is just presenting a fact, then the tone is formal. In contrast, source B is a person's opinion, right? So this person is saying what? This will definitely increase my transportation costs. We know that this person is unhappy. There's a surprise tone, there's a critical tone, there's an element of unhappiness. So because there are difference in tone, they will say that both are different in tone. Notice how in my answer, I'm identifying the differences and I'm also explaining the differences as well. So what are the useful words for comparison if you're talking about similarities? These are some words, connecting words you can use. For differences, you can use these connecting words. But the main idea is just use whatever that you are familiar with. As long as in your answer, I can clearly see that you are comparing similarities and differences, then your answer is good to go. Can so these are just level of marking. So you realize that if the question is just asking for similarities or differences, then you realize this is the level here. Um, Let me just do some highlighting here. Of course, levels of markings are not rigid. It really changes depending on the source or depending on responses that students give. But minimally, you realize level 3 is a comparison of content. I would expect everyone to be able to do this because comparing our content is something that you guys have been doing since Sec 2 history or maybe even Sec 1 history, right? Level 4 or 5, you realize the asterisk here, like I said just now, it's not rigid. Just because you do comparison on purpose doesn't mean you always automatically hit highest level. Sometimes when you compare tone or purpose, it's the same level. So just make sure, just to keep in mind that tone and purpose is highest level, I expect everyone to be able to do comparison of content. Okay, so for example, if the question is asking for both similarity and difference, similarly also, don't harp too much about, oh, my answer is which level, my answer is which level. Just make sure that you should be able to find basic comparison of content at the most minimal level because this should be something that you should be able to do. Can similarly for tone or purpose, you realize I asterisk here. It really depends on the source. Levels of marking is not rigid. It really depends on sources, on what you guys respond to us. So don't worry too much about, oh, my answer hit which level, my answer hit which level. As long as, let me just show you guys again. Uh, Let me just show you guys again. As long as you have these three items in your answer and you do it properly, you back it up with evidences and you explain it well, then your answer is good to go. Can I hope that this lesson has been useful. Remember, when it comes to SBQ, practice really makes perfect. If you have any questions, please ask your SS teachers. Thank you.